Say you have $600,000 sitting in your own super pension and your spouse has $1,800,000 in theirs. You have done exactly what most advisors tell you to do. You have set up a reversionary pension, so the day you die, your $600,000 flows straight across to your spouse. No paperwork, no delay, nothing lost. It feels like the safest move a couple can make. But here is the number almost nobody checks before signing that form. The general transfer balance cap sits at $2,100,000 per person. Your spouse already has $1,800,000 in their own pension. Add your $600,000 on top of that, and their balance jumps to $2,400,000. That is $300,000 over the cap. And the tax office will not send a warning letter first. It only reacts once the excess is already sitting there. Once that happens, your spouse cannot just leave the money where it is. Some of it has to come back out of pension phase, and there is tax to pay on the way. The plan you built to protect them ends up costing them money at the exact moment they can least afford to deal with it. I used to think a reversionary pension was close to bulletproof. I recommended it without a second thought for years, because on paper it solves the one problem everyone worries about, which is money getting stuck in probate while a grieving spouse waits for access. Then I watched a couple get hit with a tax bill they never saw coming, because nobody had checked what their combined balance would actually look like the day one of them died. Most people never run that number before they set up a reversionary pension. So before we go further, if you are a self-funded retiree with a spouse who also has their own super, hit subscribe now, because I am about to show you exactly how to work out your spouse's cap and the one figure you need to check before you add a single dollar to it. The transfer balance cap is simply the total amount you are allowed to hold in super pension phase without paying tax on the growth inside it per person. From the 1st of July 2026, that general cap sits at $2,100,000. Go over it, and the excess does not just sit there quietly, waiting to be dealt with later. The tax office treats it as though it kept earning money every single day it stays above the line, and it taxes that notional growth. Here is the number that trips people up. On a $300,000 excess, a year of that notional growth can land somewhere around $30,000, and the tax office charges 15% of that on a first-time breach. That works out to roughly $4,500 a year, gone. For as long as the excess is left sitting there, breach it a second time and the rate doubles to 30%. Here is the part that catches most people off guard, and it is worth pausing on. This has nothing to do with your income tax bracket. It does not matter whether your spouse earns $40,000 a year or $400,000. The tax office applies that same flat penalty to the notional growth, and it keeps charging it year after year until the excess is physically removed from pension phase. There is no waiting it out quietly in the background. Think about David and Margaret, both 62. David has $1,800,000 in his own pension. Margaret has $600,000 in hers. They set up a reversionary pension on Margaret's account years ago, back when their advisor told them it was the tidy way to protect each other. Nobody sat down and modelled what David's balance would look like the day Margaret's pension landed on top of his. When it does, David is sitting at $2,400,000, and $300,000 of that is now an excess balance, generating a tax bill every year it stays there. The tax office is direct about this. Once your balance in retirement phase goes over your personal transfer balance cap, you become liable for excess transfer balance tax. And that liability starts accruing from the day the excess appears, not from the day you happen to notice it. That matters, because most people do not check their spouse's current cap position before they set up a reversionary pension. The paperwork gets signed once, filed away, and forgotten. None of this means David and Margaret did anything careless. The system is genuinely complicated, and most of the standard advice around reversionary pensions focuses on the upside, which is avoiding probate delays. Without walking through what happens to the surviving spouse's own cap afterward. You are not being slow if you have never heard this explained clearly before now. You just were not given the full picture. But the cap trap is not the only place this catches people out. There is a second trap waiting for exactly this kind of couple, and it shows up the moment one of them dies. And the survivor is left holding an SMSF they suddenly have to run alone. Say the cap trap gets managed properly. There is still a second trap waiting, and it is the one that catches self-managed super fund trustees completely off guard, because it does not show up until the day it is already happening. When a member of an SMSF dies, every asset the fund holds has to be revalued at market value, as at the date of death. That sounds like a formality until you own something that is not easy to price on short notice. A rental property, a block of rural land, shares in a private company, none of these come with a number attached. They need a proper valuation, and that can take weeks, sometimes months, while the fund is still legally required to sort out what it owes. Picture David again, now the sole trustee after Margaret's death. Their SMSF owns a rental property worth around $800,000, and the fund holds $50,000 in cash. Margaret's death benefit, the amount owed to their adult children, comes to $300,000. David does not have anywhere near that sitting in the fund as cash. This is the moment most people assume they can just work through the paperwork. They cannot. David has two realistic options, and neither of them is simple. He can sell the property, which usually means accepting a lower price because he is selling under time pressure, not on his own terms. Or he can try to borrow against the fund to cover the shortfall, which brings its own risk, because if that arrangement is not set up on strictly commercial terms, the tax office can treat the income it generates as non-arm's length income and tax it at the top rate instead of the concessional rate super normally enjoys. I remember sitting with a client going through their SMSF asset register after a death in the family, watching them realize they had no idea how to value their rural property as at that specific date. They assumed a council rates notice would be close enough. It is not. The tax office requires a proper valuation from a qualified valuer, and until that number exists, the fund cannot finalize what it owes anyone. None of this is about being disorganized. Most trustees run their SMSF perfectly well for 20 years and never once think about what happens to its liquidity the day one of them dies, because day to day, running the fund never requires thinking about it. The problem only surfaces at the worst possible moment, when there is no time left to fix it properly. So you have seen two traps now. One sits in the transfer balance cap, the other in SMSF liquidity. There is a third trap, and it is the one that catches people who think there is a clever way around the tax bill entirely, by timing a withdrawal right at the very end. Somewhere along the way, a lot of people pick up the idea that if you withdraw everything out of super right before you die, your kids avoid the tax on it altogether. It sounds logical enough on the surface. If the money is already out of the fund, surely it cannot be taxed as a death benefit anymore. It is worth naming why that idea feels so appealing. When a problem is complicated, the mind reaches for the simplest possible fix, and pulling money out early feels like a clean, one-step solution to something that otherwise involves lawyers, tax rules, and paperwork nobody wants to deal with while they are grieving. I understand why it seems to make sense. But the law does not look only at where the money physically sits on the day someone dies. It looks at intent and timing. A withdrawal made as part of an arrangement to sidestep death benefit tax can still be treated by the tax office as a death benefit, even if it technically left the fund first. Super has to be paid out as soon as practicable once someone dies, and that requirement exists precisely to close off this kind of workaround. There is also a piece people miss entirely. The tax on a death benefit does not depend on when the money was withdrawn. It depends on who receives it. A dependent, such as a spouse, generally receives it tax-free. An adult child, who is not a dependent, pays 15%, plus the Medicare levy, on the taxable component, and that applies whether the money came out of the fund the week before or was paid directly to them as a death benefit afterward. Changing the timing does not change who the beneficiary is. So the deathbed withdrawal is not really a strategy. It is a workaround for a problem that already has a proper solution, one that does not rely on timing anything at the very end, and does not require anyone to make decisions under that kind of pressure. Once you accept that timing will not save your family any money, the real work becomes doing something about it while you are still healthy enough to plan properly, not from a hospital bed trying to remember a bank login. Here is the strategy that actually works, and it works because it does not try to outrun the tax office. It works inside the rules the tax office already publishes. It is called a recontribution strategy. If part of your pension balance sits under the transfer balance cap, you can withdraw a lump sum from it tax-free because you are over 60 and it is already in pension phase. Then you put that same money back into super as a non-concessional contribution. Nothing about your total balance has grown or shrunk. What has changed is the mix inside it. Because you have converted a chunk of the taxable component into the tax-free component, that mix is what your kid's eventual tax bill is actually calculated on. Right now, the non-concessional contribution cap sits at $130,000 a year. And if your total super balance was under $1,840,000 as at the 30th of June, you can bring forward 3 years of that cap in one go, which means contributing up to $390,000 in a single transaction. So if Margaret withdrew $300,000 from her pension and recontributed it as a non-concessional contribution, that entire amount shifts from taxable to tax-free. When she eventually passes, David receives her death benefit tax-free anyway because he is her spouse. The real payoff shows up later, if that money is ever paid on to their adult children, because a larger tax-free component means a smaller amount their kids ever pay 15% on. Before doing any of this, go back to the first trap. Check your spouse's current transfer balance cap position before you add a reversionary pension on top of it. The recontribution strategy fixes the tax rate on what eventually gets paid out. It does nothing to fix a balance that is already sitting over the cap. Both problems need solving, and they need solving in the right order. The framework is not complicated once you see it laid out plainly. First, check your spouse's current transfer balance cap so you know whether adding your balance to theirs creates an excess. Second, work out your own taxable and tax-free components, because that is what determines how much tax your kids would actually pay. Third, if you have room under the non-concessional cap, withdraw and recontribute to shift more of your balance into the tax-free component. Fourth, update your binding nomination so the money actually goes where you intend it to. I did a version of this myself the year I turned 60. I withdrew $200,000 from my own pension and recontributed it as a non-concessional contribution. It moved my taxable component down significantly. It means if something happened to me tomorrow, my wife receives everything tax-free as my spouse, and if it ever passes further down the line to our kids, they are paying 15% on a noticeably smaller amount than they would have otherwise. There is still one piece left that trips people up even after they have done everything else properly, and it is the one document that decides whether any of this actually goes where you planned. A binding death benefit nomination is the document that tells your super fund exactly who gets your balance when you die, and it is the piece that makes everything else in this video actually count. Without a valid one in place, the trustee of your fund, whether that is a large retail fund or your own SMSF, gets to decide who your dependents are and how the money is split between them. That decision might not match your will. It might not match what you and your spouse agreed on at all. Let's bring this together. Check your spouse's transfer balance cap before you add a reversionary pension to it. Use a recontribution strategy, done properly and in the right order, to bring down the taxable component your kids would otherwise pay 15% on. Make sure your SMSF, if you have one, actually holds enough liquid cash to pay a death benefit without a forced sale. And keep a valid, up-to-date binding nomination sitting behind all of it. Because none of the other steps matter if the fund ends up deciding for you instead. If you are a self-funded retiree with a spouse and a self-managed super fund, you now know the numbers most people never check until it is already too late. Subscribe to Aussie Retirement with Bob, because next time I am walking through exactly how to set up a binding nomination the way the tax office expects to see it, so it cannot be challenged later. The super system is not designed to trip people up on purpose. It is just complicated enough that most people only find out where the gaps are after they have already fallen into one. You do not have to be one of them. You just need to know where to look before it happens. I am Bob, and I will see you in the next video.